Okay, class, let's move on. So this lecture is going to focus on Book 7 of Plato's Republic. So in your readings, the editors have taken bits and pieces of all 10 books of Plato's Republic. So I'm going to concentrate on Book 7, which is the culminating point in the dialogue. But I'd like you to read the excerpts from all 10 books that I have indicated on the syllabus. And I'll try to take bits and pieces from the other 9 books and use those to shine light on this culminating moment. So this lecture is on Plato's Republic, and it will concentrate on Book 7. Before we do that, though, I just want to make a couple comments about the end of a dialogue called the Phaedo. The Phaedo is a longer dialogue. It's one of the early dialogues. And the dramatic context of the Phaedo is Socrates actually drinking the hemlock and the death scene. So apparently, in real life, in history, there was a law in Athens at the time that no one could be executed during this religious period. And apparently it lasted quite long. So Socrates was in jail for a long time. Now there's another dialogue, an early dialogue called the Crito. Socrates had a friend, Crito, an old friend from childhood, and Crito would come to the jail, and Crito had paid the jailer to look the other way and to allow Socrates to escape. And he and Socrates engage in this dialogue, which is called the Crito. And Socrates convinces Crito that since the laws are sacred, that even though the law was being applied improperly in his case, that to break the law would be sacrilegious. So he doesn't leave and he faces his execution. So that's called the Crito. There's a lot more to the Crito than that, but that's the dramatic context. The Phaedo is very rich and deep dialogue. I see in our textbooks, the anthologies that I had you buy, it has a long excerpt from the Phaedo. But I just wanted to reflect on the last words of Socrates. So it's called Phaedo because Phaedo goes to the temple of Poseidon. I had been there actually. It's a temple that overlooks the banks on the it's about 2 hours from Athens along what they call the Gold Coast. It's very gorgeous, and nowadays the rich Athenians have villas on the coast. But then there's one point that looks like maybe 800 feet looking down over the ocean, and there's this temple in ruins of Poseidon, the god of the sea, and actually Lord Byron's signature is there. He put his signature on that temple when he fought against the Turks and on the side of the Greeks. So it's a splendid place. At any rate, Phaedo was there. He saw the ship coming in, which signaled to him that today would be the day that Socrates has to be executed. And so he goes into the cave, into the prison where Socrates was being held. And Socrates is waking up in the morning, and he's putting Aesop's fables to verse. And he says he had felt that he hadn't spent enough time with music. And so he's doing that. And then this long dialogue ensues, and many of the arguments for the immortality of the soul are laid out clear as a bell in this dialogue. So it's very deep and great, and Socrates entertains all these different possibilities of what might happen to anyone after they pass. And then it comes time for Socrates to drink the hemlock, and so he does. Let me read from you the last paragraph here. So Socrates, they all start weeping, and Phaedo starts crying, and Socrates says, stop doing that. That's why he sent his wife away, because she was becoming too emotional. And so he says, but he walked away until he said that his. So he drinks the hemlock. Actually, he makes a little joke before he drinks the hemlock too. He says, "Would you all like to share in this libation?" Which is kind of interesting. I mean, we don't know if this really happened or not, but he dies making a joke at the end of his life, which is quite heroic. And of course, no Socrates. That one you can drink by yourself. So he walks around until his legs get heavy, and then he lays down on his back, as he was told by the jailer. And the man who gave the poison began to examine his feet and prick his legs to see where the numbness. And apparently, when the numbness reaches his head, then he'll be gone. And so they had covered Socrates' head. And right before he passes, well, the text reads this way. And Socrates felt himself and said that it had come to, and Socrates felt himself and said that when it came to his heart, he should be gone. He was already growing cold about the groin when he uncovered his face, which he had covered, and spoke for the last time. So these are Socrates' last words. A man of words, these are his last words. So we might want to focus on that. Crito, he turns to his friend. We owe a cock to Asclepius. Do not forget to pay it. Actually, I checked the Greek text. It says we, and it's in the vocative case, which is o Crito. It's like when you're hailing somebody from afar. There's one of the cases in Greek language, the ancient Greek. It's called the vocative case when you're hailing someone, like o Crito. Not woe is me kind of oh, just when you're hailing someone from far away. O Crito, we, and it's not I. The text says we. So I'm not a Greek expert, but I did check this because I wanted to. I wrote on this in one of my publications. So his last words were, "O Crito, we owe a rooster or a cock to Asclepius. See to it and don't forget." Now, the traditional interpretation of those last words, actually, in your book, there's a little footnote, and it says Asclepius was the god of healing, which is correct. In ancient times, Asclepius was the god of healing. And it was customary, like if somebody was healed, then one would go to the temple of Asclepius and make a sacrifice, maybe a rooster, and thank Asclepius for this healing. But the translator goes on to say in this footnote, when one recovered from an illness, it was customary to offer a cock as a sacrifice, a rooster as a sacrifice. And so he concludes from that with the word so, which is a conclusion indicator from logic. So, this translator concludes, Socrates' last words imply that death is a kind of healing. Well, when I read that, it didn't fare well with me, because that would mean that Socrates felt that his life was a long sickness and that death was the cure for life, which is a sickness. Well, that's not a very favorable attitude towards life, is it? Well, when I put that back in the context of all the dialogues that I read, and I have read all the dialogues, some I know a lot better than others, but I've read them all. It just didn't fare with the character of Socrates, who had this affirmation of life. Now, in one of my publications, I wrote a paper, an essay. It's called "The Problem of Nietzsche's Socrates." And as in Nietzsche's later career, he launched a very strong critique of Socrates. And so I defended Socrates in using Nietzschean philosophy, because I had appropriated Nietzsche's philosophy as part of me, but I used that philosophy against Nietzsche to defend Socrates, and I presented that. And then it was published in very prestigious journal called Philosophy and Rhetoric. And then people had written on that, and it became a kind of controversy. Um, and so I ended my essay with these last words, which substantiated, with my interpretation of these last words, which substantiated my interpretation of Socrates. And so, what is the opposite of resentment? If the traditional interpretation is that Socrates felt that life was a sickness and that death was the cure, then the opposite of that, the opposite of resentment, is gratitude. So, and the translator even says that it was customary. So it was customary to feel gratitude when somebody had been healed. So my interpretation was that Socrates and Crito, which in Crito belonged to the inner circle of Socrates, when he said we. Like I said, your text says I, but it says we in the original text. We, you and I, Crito, and he meant the inner circle, the people who live philosophically. Through philosophy, we become whole. We've healed ourselves. We lived a rich, full life. So he feels no resentment, no, what's the word? When you, the word's not coming to me. When you feel that that something is missing in your life. No regrets. He feels no regrets. He's lived this rich, full life because he lived philosophically. Actually, the word whole and heal are connected etymologically. He made himself whole, and he was able to heal himself by living a philosophical life. So now at the end of his life, he's feeling thankful. And so he wants to thank Asclepius, the god of healing, which is just the opposite interpretation of the traditional interpretation. And it has substantiated my defense of Socrates against Nietzsche's criticisms. There's a lot more to my paper. The paper that I'm referring to has to do with rhetoric and language, and so those are my interpretation of the last words of Socrates. That philosophy brings a healing, and he felt gratitude towards life. So now let's talk about the Republic. The Republic is truly great work. It belongs to the canon of Western literature and philosophy. It's one of the longest books of all of Plato's corpus, of all the dialogues. It's 10 books long. The only book that's 10 books long is the Timaeus, which is the cosmogony and cosmology. And then the laws are quite long also. So I told you, Plato, the political was at the forefront of Plato's thought because he was an aristocrat, and his brother Glaucon and Andimontis. Glaucon actually became a politician. Glaucon and Andimontis appear in the Republic, and they're two half brothers of Plato. So it's 10 books long, and actually, let me just tell you about the title first. The original title of the book is called Politia, Politeia, which means that's where we get our word police, political, politician, and so on. It comes from polis, means city-state. Politia means the structure of the state. Okay, so, or regime. But the word regime has gotten all these negative connotations from the 20th century, like fascism and Nazism and communism. And when we think of the word regime, a lot of connotations cling to that word. So it's hard to say that word without all that baggage. But one could think about the word regime in a neutral way. It just means the structure of the state. And so what the Republic is all about is Plato's way of constructing what he claims to be the ideal polis, the ideal city-state, the politia, the structure of the state that would make possible liberty and justice for all. Okay, so this is a very important book, especially for today, where politics is at the forefront of our lives. I mean, some of our lives. It's the beginnings of the history of Republican political theory. Now, Plato's not real fond of democracy, so it's not a democratic republic. It's an aristocratic republic. So where did the word republic come from then, if the book was called Politia originally? Well, this is the Roman interpretation. The book is really a republic. The word republic comes from res publica. When the Romans were referring to the state or something political, they would just say the word thing. Res means thing in Latin. Then publica means people. So res publica is the Latin for republic. That's the Anglo interpretation, which means a people thing. Res publica means people thing. So if you study the history of Republican political theory, and it really starts here, well, actually, you can get fragments from Solon, from Democritus. Remember, I mentioned those when I was talking about the pre-Socratics. But the real the biggest extended discussion of Republican political theory starts with Plato's Republic. So this is a very important book for thinking about our republic. And you can be sure that people like Thomas Jefferson and Adams, that they had studied these. But they went back mostly to the Roman Republic, but they learned from the Greeks also. So when the Romans studied Plato, people like Cicero, then they translated Politia into Res Publica, and then so we start calling the book the Republic. It is a republic. And so he's what will be the structure of the state such that it will bring about the well-being of the people. Okay, so this is Republican political theory. But it's not democratic, it's aristocratic. So what does that mean, aristocratic? Well, it's surely not dictatorship, it's not tyranny. There's a group of rulers that are enlightened rulers and educated in a certain way, and they're ruling the republic. So the people are not ruling themselves. So this is not, we just have to know that right at the beginning. But there's so much we can learn from Plato's Republic about Republican political theory. But what we're trying to do in this country and in other countries as well is to preserve a democratic republic. But it's easy to say words. What matters is what's really going on in real time in life, in praxis. You know, we can say it's a democratic republic, but is it an oligarchy really, or what? I mean, words are cheap, right? In fact, that's what I wanted to talk about when we come to the allegory of the cave, about how what philosophy is all about is looking at words and trying to give real significance to these words that are referring to only the copies of the reality of things. Okay, so it's 10 books long. I'm going to ask you to read the excerpts. So what the editors of your book have done is it goes from page 59 all the way to 124. So I don't know how many times, and I'm not always in agreement with the kind of things they cut out, but he did it. They did their best to give you the key sections of each book. They took a little bit from each book. But what happens is book one is the introductory book, and it raises all the important questions, and it's sort of introductory. And then from 2 to 7, Plato and the people that are at the home of Cephalus, they develop in language the ideal city-state, the structure of the state. And then from books 8, 9, and 10, he shows the degeneration of the state, how the state will degenerate. Okay, so he builds it all up, it culminates in book 7, and then 8, 9, and 10, he shows the degeneration. So there's so much to be learned from the Republic. I read I've been teaching book one a lot in my philosophy through film class. I have my class read the whole of book one. When I read what in your book, they took out most of book one, and but they left the best part. It's the part where Thrasymachus comes in. But let me just talk a little bit about book one and a little bit about the key themes in the Republic, and then I want to concentrate on book seven. The This is probably the most famous passage in all philosophy. Even people that know just a little bit about philosophy has heard about this. It's called the famous allegory of the cave. See, Plato is at home in the poetic word as well as the philosophical language, because by now we've moved out of the age of the heroic age of the Greeks, where it was all poetic wisdom, and now Plato is sort of straddling both. He can do both. He's a poet dash philosopher, so he can create myth, allegory, but he's not using the myths in the same way that the poets used it. With the poets, the myth is an original disclosure. With Plato, they're allegories and they're working for the sake of philosophical idea. All right, so while the dialogue starts, I'm going to have to keep telling myself what not to say. Otherwise, I'll be talking forever about the Republic. But let me just make some comments about book one. So the dramatic context is there's this celebration going on, um, a religious celebration. The Greek religion was much more public than Christianity is. Christianity is much more internal, conscience um, an internal reflection on what's happening inside of you. Although there are external things, of course, with Christianity, but the Greek religion was much more public. Um, so there's this big religious ceremony going on in honor of Bendis, which is like a mother goddess, a kind of cult that came from, not cult in a negative sense, but a sect, a religious sect that came from the island of Thrace. And Socrates is in Piraeus, which is the port. Even today, it's called Piraeus. And as soon as I say that word, it comes to my mind because I've been there so many times. Now it's just ships from all over Greece. You know, it's a big shipping town. And then there's the port. It's the main port in Greece. About 2.5 hours outside of Athens. There's another one to the west, and then this is the main one to the east. And when you go to Greece, then Piraeus is the port where you would go to the islands or anywhere. So in ancient times, then so they're down there, and this is where the celebration is going on. And Socrates is on his way home, and he meets some friends. They hail him from a distance. "Oh, Socrates, where are you going?" "I'm going back home," he says. And they catch up to him. "Well, we're going to the home of Cephalus." And he's this rich person who has a mansion in Piraeus. And they're going to have a discussion and food and drink and so on. Oh, Socrates doesn't want anything to do with it. But then they lure him there. They sort of banter with him. "Oh, we're stronger and younger than you, Socrates. We're going to, force you." But what gets him to go there is there's going to be people there who he can converse with and philosophize with. And Socrates had that weakness for he loved to philosophize. It was like a feast for him. So he goes there. Now they show up in the home of Cephalus. Cephalus is this old man, and the dialogue starts very naturally. This is one of the qualities of great art, when it just unfolds and it looks like it's just happening naturally. So he shows up there, and oh, who's all there? Well, he's there. Plato's brother Glaucon is there. His other brother Andimontus is there. And of course, Cephalus, that's his home. There's another person, his name is Polymarchus. That's Cephalus' son. And he's going to inherit all Cephalus' money. And then the main character is Thrasymachus. In fact, my research on this dialogue, on this book one of the dialogue, is that this dialogue was an independent dialogue at first. It was called the Thrasymachus. And then Plato realized I can use it to be an introduction to a larger, bigger book, Politeia, the the Republic. And there's another person, Klyptophon. So the main character, and they cut out the, if they didn't cut this up, you'd be reading the whole Republic. So the whole idea of an anthology is to make it readable. So they cut out most of it. But the big questions are raised in it. The dialogue just gradually, very naturally moves to, well, he starts asking Cephalus if he could you give us some wisdom since you're so much older? Apparently Cephalus is quite old. We don't know how old he is. Well, Socrates is like 70, so if he's older than Socrates, he's got to be like in his 80s maybe, or even older. And can you give us some wisdom since you've gone, a long ways before us? What's the wisdom of an older man to us? He says, well, money is an important thing. The reason money is, and he's made quite a bit of money in his life. And the reason is that you can pay your debts and you don't have to compromise your principles. If you think about that, there's something to that. If you have all the money you need, then you don't have to compromise. There's no motive there to compromise unless you have some other problem, ethical problem in your character. So he says that. And so Socrates says, well, then, do you think that's justice, that you pay your debts and not to compromise your principles? Yes, Socrates. Then Socrates starts examining. Now, this is how he lived. He would ask a question. This is the dialectic. Remember, we talked about that. This is the key theme in Plato's philosophy is called dialectic. So dialectic means philosophical conversation. Through dia, logos, something comes forth from concealment into unconcealment, which is a gathering. Those are the elements of the dialectic. So he says, well, paying your debts and not compromising your principles, that's justice. And not lying, because if you have all the money you need, you don't have to lie. That's what Cephalus says. Well, Socrates then comes up with a counterexample. Well, what if, and he just comes up with this counterexample. See, the point is, if you have a definition of something, and that definition can hold only if it's universal. So if you can come up with a counterexample to that definition, then you've deconstructed the definition. You have to come up with a better definition. So he says, well, so he comes up with, he just uses his imagination. What if your friend lent you a sword and he comes to your house in a crazed way and he's so mad at someone and he wants his sword back? And you're going to pay your debt and you can't lie to him. Should you give him the sword? Oh, no, Socrates, you can't give him the sword back. He's in a crazed state of mind. He might use it in the wrong way. Well, now he's come up with a counterexample. It's a silly example, but it's enough to show that justice is not merely paying your debts and not compromising or not lying. Well, other things are said, and Cephalus drops out of the conversation right away. It's not right away, but after some time. And I think Plato does that to show that for a man like Cephalus, philosophizing is not pleasurable. It's not a feast or anything. It's just like whatever. And then he just drops out. Well, then his son picks up the argument, Polemarchus, and they make a joke about it, just as Polemarchus is going to inherit his father's wealth, now he's going to inherit the same argument. And they go through all these definitions of the argument. The dialogue starts moving into justice. Remember I said the early dialogues are all a chain of dialogues focusing on one moral virtue or arete, excellence of character. Well, this dialogue is all about justice, because the best polis, the best state, is one that will provide for justice for everyone. Okay, so it's very important that, so what is justice? That's the big question. And justice is one of those things that pertain both to individuals and to the state. Like people can be just or unjust. And then there can be states that are just or unjust, like tyrannical states or, you know, tyrannies or fascist states or so on. So this dialogue is all about justice. So the question comes up, what is justice? That's important because we're going to try to structure our state on the basis of justice. Well, what makes Plato such a great writer is that he takes these definitions that are predominant in his time, and some of them are predominant even in our own time because they're so deep ingrained in our being that they hang around for millennia. Like one definition that comes up is that justice is helping your friends and harming your enemies. Well, that's around and well today. And then Socrates points out, well, isn't it true that sometimes our friends turn out to be bad people, and our enemies, they might be good people? Like I can imagine being a German in Nazi Germany. There's not much of a choice if you're asked to go to service, or a young 17-year-old, 20-year-old person, right? Might be a wonderful person, but he's a Nazi, right? So you could be a good person and be somebody's enemy, or you could be a bad person and be somebody's friend. Well, that harbors a contradiction then. Justice would mean harming good people and helping bad people. Well, that doesn't sound right. I mean, how can justice be helping bad people and hurting good people? Do you see how the dialectic is working? Socrates he has these really powerful critical mind where he can take definitions, examine them, and he's not just doing it to be, you know, a troublemaker. He's doing it so that they could find out what is justice. But this is Plato's genius. He's taking these very powerful, very important definitions of key realities, and he's deconstructing those, saying, no, that's not what it is. And so if that's not what it is, then what is it? Well, that's the question. That's what we need to find out. So the whole of book 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 is showing what is justice. There's no answer in book 1. But the key figures in this first dialogue, I'm going to abbreviate this because I'm going to end up just talking about book 1. But the key figures in book 1 are Socrates and Thrasymachus. And they become opposites, okay? Actually, now that I think about it, I think I'm going to make 2 lectures, and I'm going to just talk about book 1, and then I'm going to just stop and cut this off a little early. I'm going to make another one on the allegory of the cave. So this one is going to be just on book 1 and the Republic in general, okay? So that way we can start fresh on book 7. So let's go back. So book 1, I just got through saying that the key figures are Thrasymachus and Socrates. So these two are opposites for Plato. At the top, the best kind of person there is. Plato saw in his inner eyes, saw in Socrates all these moral virtues. He was courageous, he saw courage, he saw temperance, he saw justice, he saw wisdom, he saw piety, he saw all the ideal excellences of character in Socrates. That's why he sets him forth as someone to be emulated. Okay. So then who would be the opposite of Socrates? It's Thrasymachus. There are other characters in Plato's corpus that I've been thinking about lately, because once I get some time, I want to write on republics and fascism and different forms of the forces that undermine a republic. I'm interested in the history of Republican political theory, and this is like the beginnings of it all. So the opposite of Socrates is Thrasymachus. There's another character in other dialogues called Callicles that one could examine. But in book 1, it's Thrasymachus. So who is Thrasymachus? Well, Thrasymachus is a sophist. Now, who are the sophists? Well, in ancient times, there were these men, this was a profession. It comes from Sophia, which means wise wisdom, right? Sophon, honor philosophon, means a philosophical man. But a sophist was one who claims to have wisdom. Notice the word philos is not in the word sophist. So a philosopher is a lover of wisdom, but a sophist claims to have wisdom. So this was a profession, and many of the noble Athenians would send their sons to these sophists to be educated. Now, metaphysically, and in terms of morality, and in terms of epistemology, you should know these words. Metaphysics is the study of reality. Ethics has to do with values and qualities of one's character. And epistemology has to do with episteme, it means knowledge. So metaphysically, ethically, epistemologically, these sophists were relativists. They believed that when it comes to reality, everyone has their own opinion. When it comes to morality, there's no right and wrong. So if there's no right and wrong, there's no true and false, everyone has their own opinion, every opinion is of equal worth. This is called relativism. And Plato thought that relativism is the most dangerous threat to philosophy, because if everything is relative, then philosophy is a moot point, because philosophy is the love of truth and what is right. So many of the dialogues, Plato is showing the distinction between sophistical rhetoric or sophistry and the true art of rhetoric, which was the language spoken by Socrates, namely dialectic. So he puts these two characters together in book 1. Now, let's put that aside for a moment. Let me tell you one of the overarching ideas of the Republic, of all 10 books. One of the overarching ideas is that the ideal state is the soul writ large. Okay, so what does that mean? It means this: if you could have an insight into an ideal soul, human soul, which is somebody's character, then you would see these moral virtues. Now, the human soul is a complicated thing for Plato, but basically it has like 4 dimensions to it. And then these dimensions have more dimensions. But basically, the human soul is made up of desires or appetites. Then we have spirit or emotions. And then we have intellect or reason. So when you study the Republic, you realize that the ideal state is broken down into these 3 parts. There are the business class and the artisans and the professional people, which correspond to passions, because what they're thinking about is the bottom line, like business people. It's about profit. So this is connected with our appetites. Then there's another dimension of the state that has to do with keeping order, law and order in the state. That's the police. And then keeping enemies out. That's the military. And that corresponds to the second part of the soul, which is spirit. And then there's the rulers. And that corresponds to the intellect. So the business class need to be temperate. They can't be greedy. The police and the military need to be courageous. And the rulers need to be wise. So temperance, courage, wisdom are 3 of the cardinal virtues in Plato's philosophy. But there's one more, which is the most important one, and that's justice. So what is justice? It's when the three parts of the soul are working in harmony, where intellect is ruling. And the injustice comes about when any other part of the soul starts to rule. Like if the appetites start ruling intellect, then you have a problem. If the business class start ruling the state, you got a big problem. And when I study Republican political theory, like Machiavelli and the others, the greatest threat to any republic is sectarian interest. One group of people bending the laws, everything for some group. So one of the overarching ideas of the republic is that the ideal state is the soul writ large. And what that means is if you could have insight into the ideal soul of a person and you just translate that into political terms and expand it, then you have an articulation of the ideal state. So there's this microcosm, macrocosm working. The microcosm of an ideal person is a microcosm of the macrocosm of the ideal state. And he draws, I drew some thumbnail sketch of it just now, and he draws it out in detail in the Republic, books 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way. So it dawned on me, and this is a little original idea I came up with, and one day I want to write it out into an essay, or that what Plato has in mind here is that if you could take Socrates' soul and expand it and translate the language into political terms, then you have the Republic. So it dawned on me as I was reading one day, I don't know when, some years ago, but now I've been thinking about it a little more, that if you could just find the opposite of Socrates and expand that, you would have the greatest threats to any republic. So you could do it now, somebody could do an analysis of Thrasymachus, find all the quality traits of Thrasymachus, read the text very carefully, get the Greek there with the Greek lexicon and go very closely to the text and find all the qualities of Thrasymachus. You would have the forces that would be most threatening to a republic. Okay, so what is it about Thrasymachus? Well, first of all, he believes that might makes right. Okay, so what does that mean? That means there's no right and wrong. There's no good and bad. There's no true and false. There's just who's ever in power. He even says that justice, then Socrates, is whatever is in the advantage of those in power. So it's power politics. There's nothing wrong with power. You want the state to be powerful. But when one group overpowers the rest, then that's not justice anymore. So he's the tyrant, the sophist. In fact, the more Socrates presses him, the more belligerent he becomes. But so you want to look at that relationship between Socrates and Thrasymachus. You have Thrasymachus is the antipode of Socrates. And the qualities of Thrasymachus's character can be expanded, translated into political terms. They become the qualities that undermine any republic, whether it's aristocratic, democratic, whatever. If it's a republic and you have these forces, it will undermine the republic. There's one point where Thrasymachus says, where he gets really pinned by Socrates' monstrous logical powers, and Socrates just doesn't let people go and say whatever they want. And so he pins him, he sort of corners him. And Thrasymachus says, okay, here's what it is, Socrates. It's when you're a ruler and the people all think you're working for them, but you're really working for yourself and for your own constituencies, then that's justice. That would be the worst ruler there can be, because the people think that the ruler is working for them, but he's working only for his own sectarian interest group, which is undermining the whole republic. So this is the worst. Yeah. So You can get that from the parts that are in your text, because when they made your book, the anthology, they left all of the parts by Thrasymachus, so you can read. And his name itself means like fiery person or something like that. I forget now exactly what his name is. So that's book one. I think I'm going to just make one more fresh lecture on book 7 on the Republic, book 7 of the Republic. But I want you to go ahead and read the whole section of the Republic, of the little excerpts of all 10 books. But it all culminates at the end of book 6, which is called The Divided Line, and the beginning of book 7, which is the allegory of the cave. And then he shows the degeneration. Okay, so I think I'm going to end it here and start fresh with the end of book 6 and the beginning of book 7, that famous divided line and the allegory of the cave. And then I'll probably give you like 2 more lectures on Aristotle. And then I'm going to give you some questions. I've been trying to think about some good questions I could make for you to write essays, little essays. And but that won't be for a little while. I wanted to cover Aristotle, and then we'll move on to. And then after Aristotle, I'll give you your first like take-home essay exam, and then after that we'll cover Hellenistic philosophy, only 2 schools of thought, namely hedonism and Stoicism, and the 2 big spokesmen for those 2 traditions are Epicurus and Epictetus, and then that will be enough on Greek philosophy. So let's end it here, and this gives you a little bit of insight into the Republic. Okay, thank you.